organic, stylish, and flexible. This is Terra. Welcome to Machines and More. Terra is a word that is used to define the planet that we live on, Earth. And if you look at this new ITX case from Fractal Design, especially in the jade green colorway, it's easy to see the earthly design language that organically flows with that name. Most notably, a piece of walnut hardwood underscores the front panel. You have rounded corners and smooth curves around the edges, the feet, and the undercarriage of the case. Small details here, but that's what sets it apart from its more industrial-looking competition. Instead of featuring a million ways to cool it, there's really just one simple mode of CPU cooling that SFF builders will employ and one single official case fan location. But underneath that elegant simplicity is a small form factor case that is also flexible and features some neat ideas, and today I'll seek to show you some of these features as well as do a test build in it and share some feedback on the case and whether or not this might be for you. Now there's a lot to cover and we won't get to all of it today. In future content I will take a look at some cooler choice details, and I'll do a higher powered gaming build that will be a very sensible performer for a case like this, and some other content, so stay tuned. Big thanks to Fractal for providing the case today for the purposes of this review. I did receive this case free of charge as a testing sample from them, but I am not paid by them for this review. They are not apprised of the review findings before you are, and the review is a result of my independent testing and exhaustive research. So first off, Terra is the latest sandwich-style SFF case from the premium Swedish company based in Göteborg. I double-checked the dimensions and they do check out. It measures in at 343 millimeters long, 153 millimeters wide, and the total height, along with the 21 or so millimeters of elevation off the work surface, is 218 and a half millimeters. So if you want to count the height from the legs, the volume is around 11.4 liters, sans offset, that's 10.4 liters. So either way, it's fairly compact. Figure it's between a formed T1V2 and a Li Dan A4H2O. On the exterior, you have these machined aluminum panels. They have long, fluted airflow cutouts instead of circles like many cases have. Like the Li Q58's panels, these are capable of flipping up, but it's the entire panel and not just half of it flipping in opposite directions, so that is pretty neat. Once open, you can access the latch, and then if you want to, the panel can just pop out, and putting it back in is super easy. Opening them up isn't something that users will have to do much after building, but it's a cool feature, and especially with zero dust management here. At a minimum, you can open it and blow out some dust easily and regularly. The top panel can also pull out pretty easily. It has an elegant leather loop at the back right here. You can also lock down these panels for safe transport. You've got a thicker CNC'd front panel here. There's a groove cut into it on the inside for the power cable, which is sleek. And beneath that is the 7.5 millimeter thick small walnut panel here, with cutouts for the power button, a USB 3.0 header, and a USB-C 3.1 Gen 2 port. Underneath the anodized aluminum panels is a steel chassis that is capable of shifting to optimize the system for either a thicker graphics card or allowing a bit more CPU cooler clearance. As a sandwich case, the amount of space available to your GPU is in contest with the amount of space for your CPU cooler. This case, like the formed T1, allows you to dial that balance in. With a sub 131mm wide card, or you might think of it as 131mm in height, because it will be vertically mounted at that point. The max thickness you can have for your card is 72 millimeters, and the corresponding CPU cooler height is 48 millimeters. On the other end of the balance, if you were to choose a narrow 43 millimeters of space for your GPU, then you can have 77 millimeters for the CPU cooler. You can move on that spectrum consisting of 7 settings in 5mm increments, and that total number between GPU and CPU clearance always adds up to 120 millimeters with a sub 131mm tall GPU. So if you do have that taller GPU between 131 and 145, that thickness allowance decreases 10 millimeters. And the max length you can have is 322 millimeters regardless. Alright, so take this GPU for example. This is the 3080X E3 that I use for a lot of case tests. It measures in at about 111 millimeters tall and 43 millimeters thick, but you do want to give a little bit of breathing room to avoid turbulence. So I wouldn't put it in position 1, just because the fans would be right up against that panel. Put it in position 2, you give this total GPU chamber 48 millimeters of clearance, and then 120 minus 48 is 72. So you have 72 millimeters of clearance for your CPU cooler. In that size bracket, sub 72, you can get Big Shuriken 3, the 70 millimeter Noctua L12S and low profile mode can pass here as well. What I did do is build with the Big Shuriken 3 Rev B, which is 67 millimeters tall, and the space between the side panel and the cooler fan was 4 to 5 millimeters, and the space away from the card was also about 5 millimeters, so the clearance figure that they quote is pretty accurate. Okay, as another example, if you're deploying a thicker card like this Gigabyte 6900 XT, which is about 58 millimeters thick, you can then set the case to position 5, which allows for 63 millimeters of GPU room so the fans won't touch or cause turbulence, and the corresponding CPU clearance is 57 millimeters. In that size bracket, you got the ID Cooling IS55, which is a great choice for that, although it will limit your CPU selection and it'll be a little bit close to that side panel. But, if you're going to run a card like that, that's what you have to deal with. In most builds featuring GPUs, you're limited to top-down, low-profile coolers, since the only way to get a 120mm AIO into this build is when you have a sub 200mm long GPU. So that AIO would go right next to the GPU if it's short enough, which, those cards do exist, but they're not a hugely popular build option these days. So being a sandwich case, it needs a riser cable to connect the motherboard to your GPU. This one does come with a PCIe 4.0 riser cable. It's a quite nice thick cable, and there's a slot in the center divider that the riser sits in, which is a very thoughtful detail. On the GPU end, there's a thick foot that further mounts above the bottom panel, and it's this foot that enables the center divider to slide and move. This riser cable is very close to the back of the GPU though. Actually, most cards will sit directly against the riser cable, and the back of the GPU will hug the back of your power supply. There's a way to space off the power supply a little bit with 6mm or 10mm standoffs, which will attach to the cage. Note that you won't be able to space off the power supply for positions 6 and 7, which is the maximum GPU, two maximum GPU modes, since the PSU has been shifted too close to the outside of the case. With this case, you can go with either an SFX or SFXL power supply. SFXL is taller and will likely eliminate the fan space underneath, since those are about 30mm taller than SFX, and I could barely fit the 25mm fan underneath the power supply when taking cabling into consideration. So if you do want the bottom fan, definitely go SFX. Typically, you will want to mount this as an exhaust fan, which will encourage intake air to the GPU and the CPU cooler. Mini-itx motherboards only, and these will mount in the upside down orientation, as is common for many sandwich style cases. Other features here, the storage options, you can have at least one 2.5-inch SSD, which will mount to the straps behind the front panel if you also decide to forego the fan under the power supply, which personally I wouldn't, because I think that's pretty important, but you do have another option for a drive there as well, and that there's a SSD tray that's included that'll hook into the bottom section. You'll see a slot on the bottom panel to do that. So let's talk build process for the case. That isn't particularly complicated in this case. In the Terra, once the top and side panels are off, I think most builders will be able to lay things out first, and they should get a feel for how things fit together, because you want to understand how your cables are going to be laid out, and that's a pretty important consideration here. Now, I understand the logic behind the bottom panel having to be fixed in place because of how the tray moves, but it would have been nice for beginning builders for that piece to come off easily like it does in the T1 V2. One thing you should do is set the position for the divider. To do that, just remove the set screws. There's going to be 2 on top, 2 on bottom. You don't have to lock it in right away. In fact, just to get an idea of the balance and how things looked, I actually left the set screws off until the end, and it was perfectly fine. I did opt to space out the power supply 10 millimeters, since even though the cards I'm testing with don't have a meaningful flow-through section, that's basically free space for cable management, right? And I think every builder can take advantage of it as long as they're not in position 6 or 7. Another thing I do plan on testing is with an NVIDIA FE card later on as well. So mounted this way though, the PSU will have some flex vis-a-vis the center divider. It can't brace against the panel, so there's going to be some movement, so expect that to be kind of unstable. And this could have been mitigated with another 2 mounting points towards the bottom of the power supply, but you know, if it's stationary, it's mostly a non-issue. So I am slowly migrating over to a Ryzen 7000 test platform for my test builds here. So we're getting towards the tail end of AM4 builds. In fact, this one may be the last, but for this one, I am using the Ryzen 5 5600, which is a sensible CPU if you have only this much CPU cooler, this one being the big Shuriken 3 Rev B, and I'm also using the Fantex 850 watt SFX power supply here. If you're going to mount that case fan, do it at the beginning. With a regular thickness fan, a fan grill would really have been ideal for exhaust, but this was a tight fit already under the tray, and many fan grills won't fit, so you got to be careful with that cable management. Which is mostly fine. Just keep it tidy and you shouldn't have an issue. Fractal provides some suggestions as well as straps and zip ties, so those will come in handy. There's only 3 front panel cables to connect, so that's easy as well on the motherboard. Power supply, it does detach quite easily, so I removed it a few times to optimize and kind of play around with the fit for the cables. After you decide that, you can pop your motherboard in place, final organize the cables. You know, at that point, you can slot your graphics card in place if you're running one. The thumb screws are in a pretty tight location for a screwdriver to access, and the way it comes from the factory, it's pretty tight, so your thumbs probably won't be able to undo it. So it's going to take you a few tries to both install it and remove it. But once your GPU cables are installed, set those divider set screws if you haven't tightened them down yet. There's no detents here, so do make sure you line it up properly visually and then tighten it down and make sure the position doesn't slip when you tighten the screws down either. So the Ryzen 5 5600 isn't one I test very often in builds, but I did happen to test it for one iteration of the T1 V2, so we can look at the results with the same exact cooler running at the same fan speed, same clock speed, same voltage here, 4.6 gigahertz at 1.25 volts, just to get an idea of the case capability here for the CPU cooling. With that system, we did have space for 2 T30 case fans, and as you can see, that's massively helpful for the CPU temps. 86 degrees at 25 degrees ambient with that kind of voltage isn't unreasonable for using a cooler like this. Most of you aren't going to be running the CPU like this. I just have to lock it that way for consistency. But for example, with a -15 curve optimizer setting, the CPU hits 4.45 gigahertz for an all-core process. And that's a very good multi-core result on the 5600, and I still think the temps are quite manageable. So most Ryzen 5 CPUs, they would be fine here on PBO, as would your power limited Intel CPUs, for example, the 13400, 12400 types of CPUs, and that's actually the route that I would lean towards, especially if you're limited to even less cooler space, such as if you have to run the IS-55, or if you have to go even smaller, like the Noctua L9 type of cooler. I think you're getting the best results with that CPU. For the GPU, first I tested the 3080 XE3, and we'll compare against some other SFF cases for consistency. Now, they don't all air cool, and if you look on the chart, I specify what the mode is, but this is just a helpful comparison point here. So looking at the results, it lands somewhere in the middle of the pack. The comparison points I would focus on here would be the A4H2O and the T1V2 and T1 reference, since those are the closest in volume. And you can see that the Terra does trail those cases by quite a bit. In fact, it's not even close, right? So based on this result, it might be super tempting to just conclude that the GPU temps are not great in this case. But I don't think that's necessarily always the right conclusion, because it's going to depend on the card's design, very importantly for this case. So for one, we do expect that it will trail some of these other cases because this one only has one case fan, right? We can't change that. In terms of the positioning, the GPU, it's already fairly close to the outer panel, so that's really not an issue here. But what I did notice was that the riser cable, remember that assembly that it sits on, that foot, was super, super hot. The bottom panel of the case directly under it was not at all. So that indicated to me that the hot exhaust air was not getting through that part of the case. That's not particularly well ventilated there. In fact, it's not really ventilated there at all. So it makes sense that that's a bottleneck. So if you look at the type of cooler design employed in this and most high-powered GPUs, the hot air, it's designed to vent out the long side of the case, right? On both sides, that's where the heat fins open up. And that can be fine in plenty of cases, but in this particular case, that closed off segment, and exhausting into it, it's going to get stuck, and this is terrible for that performance. Now, let's just prove out this conjecture. I ran a different card. The Nitro 6600 XT that I have in there right now has heat fins that run the length of the card, and that enables the exhaust to exit the case on one part and also leaves the other end of the card, which is right over that exhaust fan. So it does avoid that poorly vented bottom section. So how are the results? Well, they're fantastic. You guys might remember this much bigger case, the NR200P Max, which features a vertical GPU. The GPU thermals in this case with the vented panel, they're pretty darn good when it's run in a dual exhaust mode. Bottom exhaust, AIO exhaust. Now the Terra with the same GPU, same fan speeds, it pretty much matches the performance in the Max. So yeah, I don't think this case is optimal for high-powered GPUs with heat fins running the short direction, and unfortunately that's the cooler design for most high-powered GPUs these days. But for flow-through Founders Edition cards or cards like this, I think as long as you can avoid dumping exhaust into that dead end under that riser cable, I think the performance can be actually quite good. So, moral of the story, long story short, choose the right card for this case if you're building. So there's one more thing I noticed performance-wise, one other phenomenon that I noticed with this case. So the ventilation, it's actually pretty good. In fact, the case panels here, they don't really inhibit the cooling all that much. There's plenty of holes, right? But even with a good 4.5 millimeters of spacing in front of the cooler fan, the fluid vent pattern results in quite a bit of added noise from the way the air travels. It's amplifying and changing the noise frequency, almost like a musical instrument. So if you can, give it more room, but don't be surprised if it just sounds plain odd and slightly louder when the panels are closed. Alright, so pros of the case. I found the quality on the metalwork quite decent overall. The anodization appears consistent, even though this type of color can be very tricky. The build features are thoughtful here, like the slot for the riser cable to sit in, and the long-term maintenance is easy with how the panels flip up and how easily they remove. The build experience, it's mostly, no issues there, and I think most will agree that it looks like a pretty good case. There are a few cons. I think the wood panel, it's a really nice idea, and black walnut, it's absolutely a favorite of mine as a woodworker, but speaking from my perspective as an also woodworker, there's a problem with this, and it's showing already. And not to get overly technical, but wood is a living material. Now, the tree, it's, this part of the tree is dead, but the fibers, they do move and change with the environment that it's in. And this piece of wood is known as flat or plain sawn wood. And that means most of the boards sawn from that log are going to feature grain that's diagonal or horizontal to the surface. And a piece like this will have a tendency to cup or bow. You don't kind of just want to curl. in the direction that the tree rings curl in, and you can see this piece is already starting to show that issue already. There's a small gap here developing with with a newer case, and that's going to continue to get worse. PCs are harsh environments for wood. You have some pretty extreme temperature swings, and that's generally not a happy environment for wood. So as a manufacturer, you could make this work, though. The easiest way is to use quarter-sawn wood, and that way you end up with grain that runs perpendicular to the board surface. Wood like that is much more stable. I mean, black walnut, it's actually already a remarkably good wood for dimensional stability, so, that's absolutely fine. Quarter-sawn wood is a little bit more expensive, but it's such a tiny piece of wood here that expense is marginal. Another way is to use a much thicker piece of wood, which doesn't make sense here, or a much thinner piece of wood, because the 7.5 to 8 millimeter thick piece of wood, it's in no man's land when it comes to wood thickness. Now, it's not thick enough that the wood's intrinsic strength resists cupping, which is what the bowing that you're starting to see here, and because that wood would usually have to be at least 19 to 20 millimeters, if not thicker. And it's not thin enough to be so weak that screws or glues or fasteners can make it unmovable, which is why, you have veneer or plywood. Veneer would typically be a good choice in a scenario like this. So I don't think wood is a deal breaker. It just has to be deployed correctly, and there are a few options to fix that. So hopefully this is not a big issue for you guys, but if you do end up getting the case, I'm curious how yours is holding up. But yeah, it's like this on both sides, and for a case that seemingly has very good panel gaps, they're like super tight and super good finish quality, it's a little bit of a miss in my opinion, although I do absolutely applaud them for trying something new here. Another con, you only have one case fan, and that is very limiting. The T1V2 in smaller size, it manages to fit 2, and the slots on the panel, they're not machined here to fit a 120 millimeter fan mount on the sides. So if you wanted to kind of tinker with that possibility, you don't have much to experiment with here. Of course, you could 3D print a bracket or something like that, but it's not designed to fully accommodate liquid cooling either, and that does narrow the scope of the audience somewhat, although you can do quite a bit with a low profile cooler like you've seen here. One last thing, the riser cable being right up against that GPU backplate really concerns me because it's really tight up against it. If you feel how hot a high-powered GPU gets these days, that's not good for the riser cable. Hopefully it's insulated well enough to resist melting or fire, but here's where I feel like a small standoff to space the cable away from the divider would give just things a little bit more flex, a little bit more wiggle room there. Of course, we already discussed the poor ventilation underneath the riser cable, so that's another issue, but you do have to choose your parts accordingly in this case. So who is this case for? So first off, I think this would make an absolutely awesome, elegant, mid-powered gaming build. So if you want to run it with a more powerful GPU, then you'll have to, run one with the optimal cooler design. I think that would be okay here, but mostly mid-powered GPUs, pair it with a reasonable GPU, pair it with a reasonable CPU, like an Intel 12400, 13400, Ryzen 5 7600, those will all be perfect here. If your GPU choice can afford the CPU chamber a little bit more room, for example, that mid-powered 2-slot card would be perfect, in the 60 series, 70 series GPUs. I would feel comfortable recommending a 13600K or a Ryzen 7 when using a bigger cooler like the L12S or Big Shuriken 3. Now keep in mind, the amplified noise as fan speeds do, go higher, and that's pretty much where I would draw the line, right? Because heavy multi-core rendering with a higher powered CPU, in this case, you only have so much cooler clearance, so it's not ideal for a workstation build or something like that. So another great application here being HTPC. I think this is a really good looking case. I think it's right at home, displayed at a media cabinet. And this case can easily house the components that you need for that. Pricing for this case with the PCIe 4.0 cable is at $180 US right now. You do get a choice of jade green, black, or silver. That pricing does place it in the upper echelon of SFF cases right now, somewhere between the A4H2O and the T1V2. So it's not exactly unreasonable, considering you are getting a very well-made piece of kit, and I think other than the potential wood panel issue, the finish quality is absolutely deserving of that price. So you might have heard the term terra firma, solid ground. Fractal's Terra is a very promising foray into the world of sandwich cases, and it's absolutely a solid attempt here. There are some points where it can improve, but for the most part, Terra is on terra firma. So that will wrap up the initial review. There's going to be plenty of content to come later on this case, so stay tuned. We'll look at some air cooler comparisons. I know some of you might need some information there, but hope you've enjoyed this first look and found the information helpful. So please give a like. Also, please make sure that you're subscribed. I love doing case reviews, so please join me on this channel. Links I will leave down below for the build. Thanks for watching.